Hi everyone, and welcome to another edition of November Adult Storytime. Storytime for adults. I'm your host, Katie from Adult Services, and we are continuing on our path of celebrating National Native American Heritage Month. And our third storytime this month is going to be more of a nonfiction perspective, and we are going to be reading from an Indigenous people's history of the United States. This is the version for young people, as you can see here. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz wrote a more general adult version of this book years before this one was released, with adaptions by Jean Mendoza and Debbie Reese. And what I really love about this book is how it puts everything, it lays it all out so nicely. So today I'm going to just start with chapter 1 in the book, which is called Follow the Corn. And we're going to talk a little bit about the history of corn as a crop in the continent. So let's get started here. And I'm going to skip around just a little bit to give you the highlights, but I definitely encourage you to check this book out, either using our ebook resources or hard copy. And yeah, I think you'll really enjoy it. It's a great resource, not just for young people, but anybody who wants to learn more about this topic, and we all should. So here we go with chapter 1, Follow the Corn. History books often refer to the New World to talk about the lands now called North and South America. That term reflects a European perspective. That part of the world was not new to the people who had lived there for thousands of years when the Europeans arrived. It was home. Societies have always had their own ways of marking calendar time. You're probably familiar with the abbreviations BC and AD. BC stands for Before Christ. Anno Domini is Latin for Year of Our Lord and refers to time since the birth of Jesus. Those terms have special meaning to societies in which Christianity is the dominant religion and are commonly used even in places where it is not. Two other abbreviations that acknowledge Christianity is not everyone's religion are also used in this chapter to respect that other religions, including those of the indigenous peoples discussed in this chapter, are as important as Christianity. They are BCE, before the Common Era, and CE, Common Era. This need not be confusing. The year 45 BCE is the same as year 45 BC. And the year 1945 CE is the same as AD 1945. Human societies originated in sub-Saharan Africa. About 200,000 years ago, the people began migrating out from Africa and around the globe. Around 15,000 years ago, they began to occupy 7 areas. 3 of the 7 areas were on the land masses that are currently called the Americas. They are the Valley of Mexico and Central America, sometimes called Mesoamerica, the South Central Andes in South America, and Eastern North America. By around 8500 BCE, societies in all 7 areas of settlement were domesticating and cultivating plants. In the Americas, the most important plant the indigenous peoples grew was maize, or corn. Corn, a sacred food. Prior to 1492, corn did not exist outside the Americas. Scientists have evidence that indigenous peoples in central Mexico cultivated corn 10,000 years ago, around 8000 BCE. 12 to 14 centuries later, 6800 to 6600 BCE, corn production had spread from the Central Valley south to the tip of South America, north to the subarctic, and to both coasts of the 2 continents. This proliferation of corn and other crops, such as beans, squash, and potatoes, required vast networks of cultural and commercial exchange among the peoples of North, Central, and South America. Thousands of years ago, indigenous scientists turned a wild grain into a food source that sustained their bodies and their spiritual lives. Unlike other grains, corn cannot grow wild. Without attentive care from indigenous peoples, it would not exist. The people of Central America cultivated corn in many colors. It was even grown in deserts and other areas that were very dry. Growing it there required complex irrigation systems. By the end of the 1500s CE, the total population of what we now call the Western Hemisphere was about 100 million people. Approximately 40 million were in North America and Mexico. Central Mexico alone supported some 30 million people. For comparison, at that time the population of all Europe, extending to the Ural Mountains in eastern Russia, was about 70 million. Scientists attribute the significantly larger population in the Americas to a relatively disease-free society, whose use of herbal medicine, surgery, dentistry, and hygienic and ritual bathing kept disease at bay. Consider this. In elementary school, did you learn that some indigenous peoples thought of corn, beans, and squash as the Three Sisters? Did you help plant a Three Sisters garden as a school project? Have you read a story about the Three Sisters? Do you know the source of that story? Do you know what native nation it belongs to? Those questions are important ones. It is true that native communities all across the North American continent grew those three crops and told stories about them. They still do. But it is also true that native stories were appropriated, taken and used without permission, in ways that distort what they mean to the native nation they belong to. It might surprise you to learn that many stories of how the Three Sisters came to be aren't native stories at all. They might look like native stories, but they were made up by people who are not native. Learning to ask questions about who tells a history or a story is an important goal of this book. What you read shapes how you think about the world, whether it is history or story. And it shapes how you look at and think about people in the world too. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here, and we're going to go to a part about being a steward of the land, and what does that mean? Indigenous peoples sustained their population not only by adapting to their specific natural environments, but also by changing their environments to meet their needs. This is regarded as stewardship, or being stewards of the land. A steward is someone who is responsible for the purposeful, careful management of resources so that the needs of a group can be met, both in the present and in the future. Someone who exploits the resources for gain only in the present, leaving them ruined for future use, would not be considered a steward. By the time the European invasions began, indigenous peoples had occupied and made changes to every part of the Americas. Let's take a quick look at two of the ways indigenous peoples managed their lands and resources prior to European invasion. We will specifically consider the use of fire for agriculture and game management, and the creation of roadways that span the continent. One main tool for shaping nature was fire. Indigenous communities regularly used fire in multiple ways that changed the pre-colonial North American landscape. For example, indigenous farmers of the Northeast always carried flints to start fires as needed. Such controlled fires helped to clear space in the forest for growing corn and other crops. Instead of the densely wooded wilderness Europeans depicted in literature and art, the real American landscape included cornfields, berry patches, and groves of nut trees that contributed to the food supply. They used fire to clear space for other purposes too. Most indigenous peoples of the Americas, unlike the people of Europe, Africa, and Asia, did not domesticate animals for a ready supply of hides and meat. Instead, they created havens to attract elk, deer, bear, and other game for hunting. One strategy for doing this was to burn the undergrowth in forests. In the following springtime, animals were drawn to the young plants that sprouted. Hunters killed what the community needed to replenish supplies of meat and hides. The indigenous people who lived on the Great Plains also used fire to extend those vast grasslands to make more grazing lands for buffalo herds. With parts of the forest cleared by fire, the herds could roam the east. Native peoples also left an indelible imprint on the land with systems of roads that tied their nations and communities together across the entire landmass of the Americas. These were not just hunting paths that followed game trails, or routes that peoples could easily follow during seasonal migrations. They were well-traveled roads that tracked major rivers, like the Mississippi, Ohio, Missouri, Columbia, Colorado, and the Rio Grande. Some followed seacoasts. One ran along the Pacific coast from an urban area into western Mexico all the way to northern Alaska. A branch of that road ran through the Sonoran Desert and up onto the Colorado Plateau. From the Pueblo communities of the Southwest, travelers took roads eastward onto the semi-arid plains along the tributaries of the Pecos River. Other roads led from the northern Rio Grande to the southern plains of what is now western Oklahoma by way of the Canadian and Cimarron rivers. The routes along these waterways led to others that followed rivers from the southeast and connected with roads that turned southward toward the Valley of Mexico. From Muskogee Creek towns in present-day Georgia and Alabama, travelers could take a road north through Cherokee lands and over the eastern mountains to where the Ohio and Scioto rivers met. From there, they could eventually reach the west coast on a route that followed the Ohio, Mississippi, and Missouri rivers, crossed the Rocky Mountains, and met the Columbia River Road. Going even farther, they could reach the large population center at the river's mouth and connect with the Pacific Coast Road. When Europeans arrived on this continent, they often seemed unaware that many conditions that were useful to them were the result of indigenous people's stewardship of the land. Some early settlers remarked that in many places they could easily have driven carriages between the trees. Others commented about large clearings in the forests, some with well-tended gardens and cornfields. They did not seem to recognize that for thousands of years native people had been making roads and clearing spaces to make trading, hunting, and agriculture easier. Willfully or not, they depicted the land as empty, devoid of civilized peoples, and theirs for the taking. North America in 1492 was not a virgin wilderness. It was a network of indigenous nations, a network of peoples of the corn. The link between peoples of the North and the South can be seen in the diffusion of corn from Mesoamerica along routes created by the people and used for millennia. Both Muskogees, Creeks, and Cherokees, for example, whose original homelands in North America are located in the southeast, trace their lineage to migration from or through Mexico. Cherokee historian Emmett Starr, who uses the spelling Muskogee, wrote, "The Cherokees most probably preceded by several hundred years the Muskogees in their exodus from Mexico and swung in a wider circle, crossing the Mississippi River many miles north of the mouth of the Missouri River, as indicated by the mounds. The Muskogees were probably driven out of Mexico by the Aztecs, Toltecs, or some other of the northwestern tribal invasions of the 9th or preceding centuries. This is evidenced by the customs and devices that were long retained by the Creeks." Traditions related to corn are practiced throughout the indigenous agricultural areas of North America. Some elements are similar to those in the Valley of Mexico. Although these practices vary from one community to the next, at the core of each dance, of each song, of each prayer, is a commemoration of the gift of corn. The peoples of the corn remain connected in spite of the heavy influences of colonialism. And that is just but one chapter of this wonderful book that is, honestly, it's probably life-changing for many of us who would pick this book up. Having gotten a wonderful public education right here in Crystal Lake, there is so much in this book that I never knew and would not have known without it. So I highly encourage you to find a copy for yourself and just find out what it is you don't know yet. So interesting, and a great way to introduce yourself to the topic, especially through the foods that we eat and rely upon every single day. And corn's a big one. So again, I encourage you to pick that book up and give it a try. I wanted to again remind you to check out the Native Governance Center online. That's at nativegov.org. And you can learn more about Indigenous land acknowledgement there, as well as the National Congress of American Indians, and that's at ncai.org. You can learn about Native American Heritage Month there. And then, of course, My favorite right now is native-land.ca, where you can see native land maps overlapping our current maps and see what native nations you currently live upon. So without further ado, I wanted to thank you so much for coming and joining me for this nonfiction story time today. And I appreciate you, and I hope you're having a wonderful November. We will see you next time, okay? Stay safe, stay healthy, and happy soon-to-be Thanksgiving. Bye, everyone.